Imagine a moment of despair. You are fleeing from an unstoppable army with no way out, trapped between a vast sea ahead and a fierce enemy behind. Fear is tangible, doubts arise, and everyone looks to a leader, hoping for a miracle. Then, against all odds, something extraordinary happens. In today's story, we'll see how God provides a supernatural way out when everything seemed lost. The crossing of the Red Sea is one of the most remarkable and impactful events in the Bible, a testament to God's power and Moses' leadership. And so it is written, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on.'" Exodus 14:15. The Israelites were finally free after years of oppression in Egypt. Under Moses' leadership, they left in haste, leaving behind the land of their slavery. The people were exhausted, but freedom gave them new energy. However, as they moved toward the desert, Pharaoh, hardened in his pride, began to regret letting them go. Furious, Pharaoh realized that he had lost his great workforce of enslaved people. He knew his empire would weaken without the labor of the Israelites. Filled with anger, he gathered his strongest army, with the fastest chariots and the best soldiers. His goal was clear: bring the Israelites back at any cost. As the Egyptian army marched toward the people of Israel, a great cloud of dust rose on the horizon. The Israelites, tired from the long journey, did not know that danger was so close. They continued marching, confident they were free from their oppressors. However, their confidence would soon be tested. When the Israelites finally reached the edge of the Red Sea, the reality of the danger became clear. The vast, impassable sea was in front of them, and behind, the Egyptians were quickly approaching. Despair began to grip the people. They looked to Moses, seeking an answer, a way out of this impossible situation. But all they could see was water ahead and death behind. The people began to grumble against Moses. They said, "Is this why you brought us out of Egypt? To die in the desert?" Fear and frustration took over. The situation seemed hopeless. There were no boats, no place to run. The terror of the approaching Egyptian army was quickly closing in, and the end seemed imminent. Moses, however, did not let his people's despair shake him. He knew God had not brought them this far to let them die. With unwavering faith, he declared, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. His words brought a moment of pause, a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. As the Egyptian army advanced, the pressure mounted. The hearts of the Israelites were gripped with fear, but Moses stood firm in his faith. He trusted that God would act at the right moment in a way no one expected. And it was at this moment of greatest despair that the Lord spoke to Moses. God instructed Moses to raise his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea. The command seemed impossible, but Moses obeyed without question. He knew God's power was about to be revealed in a way that would completely transform the situation. Moses' obedience was an act of faith. The wind began to blow, strong and steady. The waters of the Red Sea began to part, opening a dry path through the middle of the sea. The people of Israel watched in awe as the impossible happened before their eyes. The path to salvation had been opened in a supernatural way. Through Moses, God had provided a way out. The Israelites, still in shock, began to march. The sea was divided into two towering walls of water, and the ground beneath their feet was dry. God had performed a miracle before their very eyes, but there was still a journey ahead. The Egyptian army, however, continued its relentless pursuit. Even with the miracle in front of them, the people felt the weight of the threat that still followed. They marched quickly, knowing they couldn't afford to waste any time. The crossing was not just physical, it was also a test of faith, a reminder that God was with them, even in the most desperate situations. As the wind continued to blow forcefully, the waters of the Red Sea stood tall like two giant walls, creating a safe path for the people of Israel. The Israelites, in disbelief at the miracle happening before them, began to cross that corridor of dry land. Each step was taken with a mix of fear and awe, but the desire to survive and reach freedom drove them to keep going. Moses was at the front, leading his people with confidence, even knowing that the Egyptian army was still pursuing them. As they walked, many looked back, fearing that the Egyptians would catch them before they could finish crossing. But although the Egyptians were drawing closer, something supernatural was about to happen that would change the course of this pursuit. God, in His wisdom, intervened once again. The pillar of cloud that had guided them by day moved behind them, positioning itself between the camp of the Israelites and the Egyptian army. The cloud became a barrier, bringing darkness to the Egyptians and light to the Israelites. While the people of Israel moved forward, the Egyptians became disoriented and unable to attack. Even with the supernatural barrier between them and the Egyptians, fear still lingered among the Israelites. The sound of the Egyptian chariots still echoed in the distance, and the doubt about what would happen next remained in their hearts. Moses, however, kept his faith strong, confident that God would complete their deliverance. As the people moved forward, the towering waves of water seemed so close that many could smell the sea and feel the damp wind on their faces. But despite the magnitude of the scene, no one could stop. Time was short, and they needed to cross to the other side before the Egyptians found a way to break through the divine barrier that held them back. The Egyptian war chariots, with their powerful horses, finally began to advance toward the path opened in the sea. The hearts of the Israelites raced, and desperation grew again. It felt as though every time they distanced themselves from danger, it crept closer again. However, there was a quiet confidence in Moses, who knew that God had something more in store. As the Egyptians entered the passage through the sea, God began to act even more directly. The wheels of the Egyptian chariots started to come off, preventing them from continuing their swift pursuit. Confusion overtook the soldiers, and the fear that had once been in the hearts of the Israelites began to shift to the Egyptians. Seeing their war chariots stuck and their wheels breaking, the Egyptians realized they were fighting against something greater than themselves. They began to shout, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Exodus 14:25. But by then it was too late to escape the judgment that was coming. As the last of the Israelites exited the safe passage through the sea, God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand once more over the sea. Moses, with unshakable faith, obeyed without hesitation. And then, in a moment of absolute power and glory, the waters that had been held back began to close, completely covering the Egyptian chariots and soldiers who were still in the middle of the crossing. The Egyptian army, which had seemed so imposing and invincible just moments before, was now completely submerged by the waters. None of those who had pursued God's people remained. The Israelites standing on the other side of the shore looked on in awe and gratitude, realizing that the Lord had fought for them. That day was forever etched in the memory of the people of Israel. It was not just a crossing. It was the manifestation of God's power and confirmation that He was their deliverer. The fear of the Egyptians was replaced by reverence and awe for God. They knew that the Lord would protect them in all future battles. The people of Israel, finally safe, lifted their eyes to the heavens in gratitude. Moses also looked at the people, seeing in their eyes the change, the newfound trust in the God who had freed their ancestors from centuries of slavery. They were now truly free, not just from Egypt, but from the fear that had imprisoned them for so long. Upon reaching the other shore, the Israelites gathered, still breathless and full of emotion. The sea, which just moments earlier had seemed like an impassable barrier, was now closed again, covering the remains of the Egyptian army. The sound of the waters returned to normal, but what had just happened was anything but ordinary. God's people had just witnessed one of the greatest miracles in history, and the atmosphere was one of awe and reverence. Moses, who had led the people with steadfastness, took a deep breath. He knew the journey was far from over, but that moment needed to be remembered. He raised his voice, and with gratitude in his heart, began to praise the Lord. His words echoed over the people who, full of thankfulness, began to join him in song. Thus began the song of victory, a praise for the deliverance the Lord had given. The song of Moses and the Israelites exalted God's power. "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." Exodus 15:2. The words were full of emotion, a deep expression of gratitude for all they had just experienced. They sang of God's greatness, how he had defeated the mighty Egyptian army and delivered his people with a strong hand. The women of Israel, led by Miriam, Moses' sister, took up their tambourines and began to dance. Miriam, filled with the Spirit of God, took the lead in that moment of celebration. She sang, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver, he has hurled into the sea." Exodus 15:21. The joy was contagious, and the whole people joined in this spontaneous worship. The crossing was not just an escape from danger, it was a turning point in Israel's history. The people who had once doubted, who had grumbled against Moses in the desert, were now full of faith. They had witnessed the impossible and knew, without a doubt, that the Lord was their God, their deliverer. Egypt, with all its military might, had been defeated by the waters at the command of the Creator. The celebration went on for hours. The drums and songs echoed across the desert, and the Israelites, who had once been slaves, now danced as a free people. They remembered the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and saw clearly that God was fulfilling his promises. The desert ahead was still an uncertain place, but now there was a certainty in every heart. The Lord was with them. Moses, seeing his people celebrating, felt a mixture of joy and responsibility. He knew that great challenges still lay ahead. The promised land was far off, and many obstacles would arise along the way. But in that moment, he also knew that the God who had parted the sea would guide them in every step of the journey. The people who had once grumbled were now singing with faith. The sound of celebration, however, began to fade. The exhaustion of the crossing and the long night of tension finally began to weigh on the people. The children, who had crossed the sea hand in hand with their parents, were now exhausted. The elders, who had seen generations of Israelites suffer in Egypt, rested, relieved to be safe. It was a moment of peace after the storm. As night fell, the Israelites began to prepare for rest. But before they slept, their final words were of gratitude. They knew that the next day would bring new challenges, but they also knew that the same God who had delivered them would continue to be by their side. The confidence in the Lord, which had been strengthened by the crossing, was now a solid foundation for the journey ahead. In the stillness of the night while the people slept, Moses gazed at the starry sky. He knew that God had been faithful, and this encouraged him to lead the people with even greater determination. Moses trusted fully in the promise that God would lead them to the promised land. He understood that, though the path would be difficult, the Lord would never fail. The Israelites, now free, rested by the shores of the Red Sea, the place where they had witnessed the impossible. They knew they would never be the same. They had left Egypt behind, not only physically but spiritually. The crossing had been more than just a physical journey. It had been an inner transformation, a rebirth as God's people. While the people slept, God continued to watch over them. The Lord, who had parted the sea and defeated the Egyptians, was with them in every moment, even in times of rest. The assurance of God's presence brought peace to the hearts of the Israelites, who now dreamed of the promised land. They knew the journey would be long, but the God who had opened the sea would also open the way through the desert. With the sunrise the next day, the Israelites woke up with a sense of renewal and hope. The sound of the Red Sea's waters still echoed in the background, reminding them of the miracle they had witnessed. Moses, seeing his people awaken, knew it was time to move on. The promised land was still far away, and the journey through the desert would be long, filled with challenges and trials. The people began to organize themselves to move forward. The pillar of cloud that guided them by day was already in place, ready to show the way. They now had a renewed confidence in God, knowing that the Lord who parted the sea would guide them safely all the way. The desert was vast and inhospitable, but God's presence was a constant comfort. As they began to walk, the first signs of the journey's difficulty appeared. The scorching desert heat, the dust kicked up by the wind, and the lack of water quickly became obvious problems. The people, who had celebrated victory the day before, now faced the daily challenges of survival. The confidence that had been strengthened by the crossing began to be tested once again. As days passed, the lack of water became critical. The people started grumbling once more. They complained to Moses, asking why he had brought them out of Egypt only to die of thirst in the desert. It was a cycle that seemed to repeat, moments of faith followed by moments of doubt. Moses, however, remained firm, bringing their concerns to the Lord. And once again, God responded with mercy. He instructed Moses to lead the people to a place where they would find water. However, when they arrived at Marah, the water was bitter and undrinkable. The people's frustration grew even more, and they turned against Moses with harsh words. Moses, distressed, cried out to the Lord for a solution. The Lord, ever faithful, instructed Moses to throw a piece of wood into the bitter waters. When he obeyed, the waters became sweet and drinkable. The people, relieved, drank with gratitude, but this experience served as another lesson. God was teaching the Israelites to trust him, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. The journey through the desert continued, and each step was a test of faith. The people moved according to the direction of the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. God's visible presence was a constant reminder that they were not alone on this journey, though the hardships often clouded that perception. As they moved through the desert, hunger became a new concern. Once again, the Israelites complained, reminiscing about the pots of meat they had in Egypt. They quickly forgot the suffering of slavery and focused on their immediate needs. Moses, always patient, brought these complaints to the Lord once again. In his goodness, God provided another miraculous solution. He sent manna from heaven, a food unknown to them but sufficient to sustain the entire people. Every morning, when the dew evaporated, the manna was there, a testament to God's faithfulness. The people gathered enough for each day, trusting that the Lord would provide daily. The manna was more than just physical nourishment. It was a symbol of the dependence God's people needed to have on him. Each day, the Israelites learned to trust God for their needs, whether through sweet waters or bread from heaven. The desert, with all its trials, was becoming a school of faith for the people. Even with daily provisions, the desert was still a hard place. The heat remained a constant threat, and the distance to the promised land still seemed uncertain. But the assurance that God was with them motivated them to keep going. They were beginning to understand that the God who parted the sea would also open paths where there seemed to be none. Moses, seeing his people sustained by God each day, knew they were being shaped for something greater. The desert was a place of transformation, and the people who had left Egypt were becoming a nation that relied completely on God. The lessons of the desert would be fundamental for their survival in the promised land. At the end of another day's journey, the Israelites camped under the stars, knowing that the Lord was with them. The pillar of fire shone on the horizon, a reminder that God guided them both day and night. And so, even amidst difficulties, the people's faith grew with each new step they took through the desert. As the days passed, the people of Israel began to understand that the journey through the desert was more than just a path to the promised land. The desert was a place of transformation, where God was shaping the character of his people, teaching them lessons of faith, obedience, and dependence. Every trial they faced was an opportunity to trust the Lord, and the crossing of the Red Sea was a constant reminder that the impossible was within God's reach. As they walked, Moses continued to lead with wisdom and faith. He knew the promised land lay ahead, but that the people needed to be prepared to receive it. The desert, with its trials, was a spiritual training ground. Moses understood that physical freedom from Egypt would not be complete without the spiritual freedom from unbelief and disobedience still residing in the hearts of the people. At one point in the journey, the Israelites faced yet another trial. The sudden attack of the Amalekites, a hostile people, threatened the safety of the Israelites. Moses, with the help of Joshua, organized Israel's army for battle. While Joshua led the warriors in the field, Moses went to the top of a hill with the staff of God in his hands, raising it toward the sky. As long as Moses kept his hands raised, the Israelites prevailed against the Amalekites. But when his strength began to fail and his hands lowered, the enemy gained the upper hand. Seeing Moses' struggle, Aaron and Hur placed a stone for him to sit on and held his arms up on either side, allowing him to keep the staff raised until sunset. With this unity and trust in God, the Israelites won the battle. The victory over the Amalekites was another testimony of God's power at work. He was always present, not just in grand interventions like the crossing of the sea, but in the day-to-day battles. The people began to realize that every victory, every provision was the Lord's doing. Moses built an altar at that place and called it, "The Lord is my banner," Exodus 17:15, declaring that it was God who led them through every struggle. As the journey continued, Moses received a visit from Jethro, his father-in-law, who advised him to delegate responsibilities. The people were growing, and Moses, who had been bearing the weight of judging all the people's disputes, listened to Jethro's wise counsel. He appointed leaders over smaller groups, allowing the people to be governed more efficiently. This was another lesson in leadership and dependence on God, who provided wisdom at every step. The journey through the desert brought many challenges, but also many moments of divine revelation. God continued to reveal himself in powerful ways, such as when he provided water from the rock at Horeb, another proof of his care for his people. In every moment of difficulty, divine provision was evident, reminding the Israelites that, though they were in an arid place, they were not abandoned. Finally, the Israelites arrived at the base of Mount Sinai, where God did something even more remarkable. He revealed himself in glory, with thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud covering the mountain. The Lord called Moses to ascend the mountain, where he would give the 10 Commandments, a covenant that would seal the relationship between God and his people. It was the next step in Israel's spiritual journey. The 10 Commandments were given not just as laws, but as a way to establish a close and lasting relationship between God and his people. It was God's way of saying that, beyond freeing them physically from Egypt, he wanted them to be a holy nation, set apart to live according to his principles. Moses descended the mountain with the tablets of the law, a symbol of the new life God had planned for Israel. The people, who once saw themselves only as slaves, were now called to be a priestly nation, a chosen people to represent God on earth. God's words at Sinai echoed as a reminder that the Promised Land was much more than just a physical place. It was a place where they would live in communion with the Creator, obeying his voice and walking in his ways. While the Israelites remained at Sinai, God gave detailed instructions on how to build the tabernacle, a place where his presence would dwell among them. The desert, which once seemed like a place of desolation, was now becoming a place where God was tangibly present. The tabernacle would be a symbol of the constant communion between God and his people. Thus, the journey that began with the crossing of the Red Sea continued. The people of Israel, now shaped by their experiences in the desert, were closer to understanding God's greater purpose for them. The path to the Promised Land still held challenges, but one thing was certain: the Lord was with them every step of the way, guiding, sustaining, and teaching them what it meant to be his people. I hope you enjoyed this content. I humbly ask that you subscribe and leave a like so you can follow our future videos. Thank you for being here. May God bless you abundantly.